Hi, here I am again with another practice, or rather model response to a practice document-based question and a quick review or debrief of that model response to show you how it achieves all or fulfills all of the requirements of the AP exam document-based question. Uh, so here's the question that you got. Question was, evaluate the extent to which the Gilded Age economy fostered change in the United States in the period from 1870 to 1900. That's an actual DBQ or LEQ prompt, actually, from a couple of years ago. But we made it into a DBQ with 5 documents, which is the number of documents you'll be getting on this year's AP exam. Um, I'm going to be referring to this document and this document, um, which is very similar to, oops, it's gone. It's very similar to Miss Black's rubric that is more uses more of the language of the College Board. But whichever one you choose to go along with, in the end, you'll be getting all of the points on the AP exam if you do the things I'm going to tell you about that I do on my sample response. Um, so to start with, in one of the things you have to do on the AP exam document-based question is provide contextualization. And remember that contextualization, I suggest that you put contextualization in the beginning. So, in your first paragraph, whichever kind of approach you're taking to the AP exam, I mean to the essay, to put it at the very beginning. I also want to note that this is a change or continuity question, so different from the kinds of questions you've been looking at these last couple of weeks, both of which were effect questions. Um, and I suggest that there's 2 approaches to writing this essay, and that is A, to argue that there was mostly change or mostly continuity. So the Gilded Age economy mostly changed things, or the Gilded Age economy mostly kept things the same. If you do option A, then you'll dispense with the counterclaim in the first paragraph, and then explore 2 ways that and that's claim 1 and claim 2, explore 2 ways that the Gilded Age economy either changed or American life or kept things the same. The other approach is to say, hey, look, there was the Gilded Age economy made some dramatic changes, but also some substantial. There were a lot of things that stayed substantially the same, and so it's kind of a half and half, cut the baby in half kind of approach. That's fine too. In which case, you'll present those 2 in your thesis and then explore them further in the body paragraphs. Either way, you're going to start with contextualization, or at least I suggest strongly that you start with contextualization. It's a nice way to introduce your essay, and it knocks out the requirement right there at the very beginning. In order to get the contextualization point, you have to adequately describe, not just say, hey, the Civil War happened, but describe the Civil War, the broader historical context relevant to the question. And by broader historical context, we mean things that happened immediately before, during, or immediately after the time frame of the question. So let's have a look at the question again. The question is, evaluate the extent to which the Gilded Age economy fostered change in the United States in the period from 1870 to 1900. So that's the time frame of the question, and that meaning, in other words, that's this part here. And I can talk about things that happened immediately before that, during that time period or immediately after? Let's go backwards. So let's say that I wanted to talk about the immediately after. Since the time frame ends in 1900, I don't know, there's a bunch of things I could talk about. Stuff that happened in the early 20th century. That could include the progressive era. You can see how that might be a very plausible, a very a reasonable piece of contextualization. I could start by saying, hey, the progressive era was a massive movement among political elites in particular that tried to address the problems of the Gilded Age, which is the topic of this essay. Right? Um, I could talk about things that happened during between 1870 and 1900 that don't have to do with the economy. Remember, they're looking for the broader historical context. So since the topic is about the Gilded Age economy, and if I want to talk about something that happened between 1870 and 1900, I can't really talk about economic things because the economic things are the things that I should be talking about in the rest of my essay. It doesn't really give the reader a broader historical context. It just provides information about the topic itself. So here I'm riffing here off the top of my head. Some ways to accomplish that would be to talk about some of the international events. So you can talk about the United States expanding abroad in the 1890s, for instance. You can talk about, I don't know, some of the reform movements of the time period, socialism, the temperance movement of the late 19th century, and things like that, as long as you're focusing more on social issues. You can talk about some of the political issues of the time period, um, the dominance of the Republican Party in the in national elections, the evenness of the two political parties in terms of electoral strength, um, the geographic divisions between Republicans and Democrats, with Democrats dominating in the South, and also among workers in the big cities, while Republicans dominating mostly among middle class and upper class elites and outside of the South primarily. Things like that. But it really can't be about the economy. That's my point. In my model response, I choose to talk about the U.S. Civil War. Remember, I can talk about the immediately before, and if by immediately before 1870, certainly one can mean the Civil War, which happened between 1861 and 1865. So that's what I choose to do. I describe the Civil War, as you'll see in a second, providing specific details, meaning I don't just say the Civil War happened, moving on, and then I explain how the context relates to the topic of the prompt. I can't just say, hey, the Civil War happened, so let's talk about what happened after that. I have to explain why the Civil War is an important context for the economic changes between 1870 and 1900. And so let me show you how I do all of that. The U.S. Civil War, so here's my contextualization. The U.S. Civil War between the so-called Confederate States and the United States, fought primarily over the issue of slavery and its expansion into the western territories of the country, temporarily reordered the nation's economy to fuel the war effort. The much larger industrial capacity of the North gave the United States a significant advantage, ultimately leading to its victory. So there is me describing the Civil War, basically, and saying more than just, hey, the Civil War happened. I provide some details. Then here is me explaining why this is related. The return of peace, however, did not restore the old economic order. Simple, and yet it makes the connection between the contextualization that I'm providing and the topic of the essay, which is the economy of the Gilded Age. And then I move on. So I've accomplished the task of providing contextualization. Now I'm going to write my thesis. And so going back to the template, um, uh, again, remember you can choose to write a option A kind of thesis, which says, or essay, which says basically there was more change than continuity, and I'm going to focus on one side of that dichotomy, or I'm going to focus evenly on both change and continuity. Either one of these is fine. I choose to go with this brand of essay. And so, in order to get the point for what they call argument complexity, argument development, I have to explore the counterclaim in the thesis because I'm going to focus on one side of the question. It just so happens to be change. I'm going to argue that the Gilded Age primarily changed things. So in my thesis, I'm going to address how some people would argue otherwise, that the Gilded Age primarily kept things the same. In doing that, I'm earning a point on the College Board's rubric. That is very important. If I don't do this kind of essay, and if I say that there's both change and continuity, I'm kind of building in that point already, so long as in one of these two paragraphs I explore the opposite of the other paragraph. In the first paragraph I say change, and here's why there was some change, and in this second body paragraph, or third overall paragraph, I explain why there was mostly why some people would argue that there was mostly continuity. The point is you can't just talk about change or continuity. You have to talk about change and continuity in your essay, one way or another. So here's what I decided to do. I'm gonna talk about change, or rather continuity, here. And I'm going to start with my counterclaim then. Some might argue that. Here's what I say. Some might argue that the economy of the New Gilded Age that followed the Civil War and lasted until the end of the 19th century bore some significant continuities to that of the pre-war era, as continued westward expansion opened up more land to European agriculture. That's my counterclaim. Remember, I don't just stop there. This is a mistake that a lot of students make in my experience reading, DBQs. That's not a counterclaim. That's just suggesting that there's an other side to the argument, but it's not at all exploring that other side to the argument. You have to explore one claim that somebody might make in support of an argument that it was mostly continuity. And that's what I do with this part here. One example of continuity is continued westward expansion, which opened up more land to European American agriculture. You also don't want to get into the weeds yet, because that's what you want to do next. You do want to support that counterclaim with a piece of evidence. You want to do the work of somebody who is arguing for continuity by proving it, at least by providing one piece of evidence. And that piece of evidence should be, as this rubric suggests, specific, substantial, relevant to the topic, and of course, accurate. That is, adequately described. Described. Let's see how I do that. The bloody conflict between the U.S. Army and the Sioux Native Americans in the Great Plains region in the 1860s and 1870s, ending in the defeat of the Sioux and their forced settlement in reservations, is an example of this. It's an example of this ongoing territorial expansion and the expansion of territory for agriculture. My piece of evidence is the Sioux Wars of the 1860s and 1870s. I talk about the U.S. Army, the Sioux Native Americans. I tell the reader where that happened in the Great Plains region, when it happened, and what was the result of that, the defeat of the Sioux and their forced settlement and reservations. I do that all in one sentence. That's enough to say that I provided a specific piece of information or more. It's pretty substantial and certainly relevant, and I can vouch for the fact that it's accurate, and I adequately described it. That's sufficient. So now I can say that I've explored the complexity of the question, or at least I've begun the process of doing that. because I've now explored continuity. Um, but wait, there's more. You don't have to do this, but in the template, I suggest that if it's applicable, if it makes sense to include a document or two from the among the documents that they give you in the claim, I mean rather in connection with the counterclaim, then you can do that in the thesis paragraph. Remember that, and I don't have this up here, and I keep meaning to change that, but I keep forgetting. For any document that you include, you have to describe the document. So say what's in it, and you have to explain how it relates to the claim, or in this case, the counterclaim that you're describing, that you're discussing. If you want to, you can also analyze for historical context, intended audience, point of view, or purpose. You have to do that this year with 2 documents. So you can choose to do that for this one or not. I decide not to, but I do include a document. The graph in document 1, that's this graph here, which plots the types of employment of Americans in the late 19th century. That's me describing the document very briefly, but nonetheless doing it, and that will give me the credit. Shows that until the last few years of the Gilded Age, most Americans were indeed farmers. That's me connecting the document to the counterclaim that continued westward expansion opened up more land to European American agriculture. Boom, I've knocked out 1 document. Now I'm going to go on to my argument. So far I've examined the context of the topic and one side of the question. Now I'm going to explore the other side of the question, and the rest of my essay will be me trying to prove that the other side holds more validity. That is, that there was more change. And here's how I do it. I first provide a sort of broad statement of my argument. However, despite this continuity, the Gilded Age economy created mostly radical change. And setting up my paragraphs, 2 claims. Firstly, the economic transformation of the Gilded Age dramatically widened the social, economic, and political power gap between rich and poor. Secondly, and there should be another claim here. I didn't include one this time. I had started writing one, but I don't want to give away stuff. I want you to be able to come up with these claims on your own, and I'm afraid that if you kind of previewed this video before doing your own DBQ, then you might lose the opportunity to really think about how you might structure your to think about ideas of your own for your essay. So I left that out. I just have 1 more paragraph instead of the 3 that I would normally have. But notice how in this claim, it's a pretty large claim. It's a pretty broad claim. The economic transformation of the Gilded Age widened the social, economic, and political power gap between rich and poor. It's not so broad that it's unintelligible. It would be a mistake to say something like, firstly, there was, dramatic economic change. That's too broad. It doesn't really tell anybody. Or even this. Firstly, there was a lot of change in business, or business types, or business management. Still, I'm not sure what you're saying there. So what I do is I provide enough of a description as to make it intelligible to the reader, so that the reader wouldn't even have to move on to the next paragraph to know what you're saying. And that's a good test for whether or not your claim is too vague. I also don't get into the specifics. Again, we've been talking about this all year, the Goldilocks rule. I don't do something like, firstly, the Gilded Age economy gave a lot of power to John Rockefeller or Standard Oil. Well, that's one very narrow example, but is he the only one? Is that the only example? That might be something I use for evidence later on, but I must have a claim that allows me to generate several possible examples of specific evidence. Otherwise, it's not a good claim as far as the College Board is concerned, and it's just not a good claim, in terms of uh, writing in general or argumentation. So that's what I do in that in that last sentence. So I've got my argument. There was more change than continuity, and I have one of the claims that I might explore in support of that argument. I should have another one, but I left it out on purpose. You should have another one. I left mine out in order not to prejudice you in one way or another. So I have a historically defensible claim, meaning I can support it. It's not bullcrap. It's neither too vague or too specific. I don't give away the evidence right away. I don't get into the details yet. And now I can move on to my body paragraphs. Oops. For my body paragraphs, remember, I strongly suggest that you just copy and paste your claim from the top. Don't need to reword it. You don't have time to waste on such trifles. Then, that's claim. Then you want to do evidence. And then reasoning. And then, if applicable, document analysis. Let's go over these one by one. First, evidence. In this body paragraph, you should present your claim from the thesis, simple, and then support it by with at least one specific, substantial, relevant, and accurate example of historical evidence, something that is not explicitly referenced in the documents, that is adequately described. So specific. John Rockefeller, Standard Oil, J.P. Morgan, U.S. Steel, Jay Gould. These names of people, names of businesses or other organizations, laws that were passed or not passed, and other major events like that. As specific as you can get, that's what's going to count for evidence. Obviously, it has to be relevant, so you can't bring in some random fact that doesn't really go along with the topic or your claim. Accurate. So make sure that you have it right, and adequately described. Finally, this is for the DBQ only, not explicitly referenced in the documents. Well, I decided to talk about John D. Rockefeller Standard Oil Company as my example. And I can talk about it because in that I can get a point for that because I look at the documents and I see that there is no explicit reference anywhere to Standard Oil Company. It is not mentioned anywhere. Neither John Rockefeller or Standard Oil are in these documents. So I can use that, therefore, as my evidence. So let's see how I do it. Embracing new business management. So anyway, the claim that I'm talking about is the economic transformation of the Gilded Age dramatically widened the social, economic, and political power gap between rich and poor. Evidence. Embracing new business management strategies, such as vertical and horizontal integration. Many businesses grew to previously unseen size and power. John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company, for example, came to dominate the oil industry, using its size to undercut smaller local competitors and ultimately buying out much of the competition. My evidence is therefore is specific. Rockefeller, Standard Oil, vertical integration, horizontal integration, substantial, relevant. It all connects with my claim about the power of wealthy people and wealthy businesses. It's accurate, I promise you. It is adequately described. That's enough. And, like I said, it's not referenced in the document, so I can get a point for that. So I've knocked out evidence. Reasoning. This is where a lot of students lose points. So far, I've made a claim about the economic transformations and how it widened the gap between rich and poor. I provided one example of that. But my job is to prove that this is a change. I haven't done that yet. And the reason I haven't done that is because I haven't explored the situation before the Gilded Age and explicitly described how that pre-Gilded Age context changed as a result of the Gilded Age, or in the Gilded Age. And so that's what I do in the reasoning part. There, I use a couple of sentences to talk about, to tell the reader why this is a change. I haven't done that until now. So, before the Gilded Age, and with a change in continuity prompt in an essay, like I've been saying all year to my students, basically you should have to make it easy for you, you might make sure that somewhere after your evidence you have a before the Gilded Age, before the Progressive Era, before the Civil War, before World War II, before this time period, so that's pushing you to talk about what things were like before. Change in continuity means you have to talk about the before and the after and explain why that's different or the same. Before the Gilded Age, wealthy elites certainly dominated the economic and political landscape. However, few businesses of national scope existed like that of Standard Oil and J.P. Morgan's U.S. Steel, and the gap between rich and poor was modest in comparison. By the late 19th century, however, more power was concentrated in the hands of a few wealthy industrialists, and the wealth gap between the toiling masses and tycoons alarmed many observers. That's where I earned the point for reasoning, and it's over here in this part of the Fernandez rubric. And here I describe, exactly what you have to do, like I just said, describing the conditions before and after. So I've earned 1 point for that paragraph. And then finally, in this paragraph, I finish up with a little document analysis. I can include 1, 2, 3, 4, a million documents here, whatever works for in this context. Remember that if I include a document in this paragraph, I have to A, describe the document. This is what's going on in this document. And B, explain how it connects to the claim in my paragraph. So, the claim in my paragraph is that the economic transformations of the Gilded Age dramatically widened the social, economic, and political gap between rich and poor. I use a political cartoon to show this. The political cartoon by Joseph Kepler. That's this one here. The bosses of the Senate. Reflects concerns over this development. Notice how I cite it parenthetically. Document 3 tells the reader what you're talking about, which document you're referring to. Here I describe the document, depicting a group of monopolists representing such figures as Rockefeller and Morgan sternly observing proceedings on the Senate floor below them. That's me describing the document. This short phrase here is me connecting the document to my claim in this paragraph. My claim is that the Gilded Age dramatically widened the social, economic, and political power gap between rich and poor. Right before I talk about this document, I reiterate that the wealth gap between the toiling masses and tycoons alarmed many observers. And then here, instead of reiterating that and restating it again, I don't need to sound redundant and silly. I say this development because the reader knows that this development is referring to the wealth gap between the toiling masses and tycoons, which is growing. So I've done 2 things I have to do in this year's DBQ, 4 documents. I have to describe each of those, and I have to explain how it connects to my claim. But for 2 documents, I also have to analyze it for historical context, intended audience, point of view, or purpose. And here's what I do here. Drawn from the point of view of someone who is anxious about the outsized power of large businesses in the new economy, The industrialists are drawn as enormous figures overshadowing the much smaller figures of the senators below them, suggesting that they truly are the bosses of the Senate and the real political power in the country. I use point of view. A lot of people gravitate towards point of view because it's often the most obvious. The point of view here is someone, I don't know anything about Joseph Kepler, but I do know clearly that he's not a fan of what's going on. So the point of view is someone who is anxious about the outsized power of large businesses in the new economy. But if I just stop there, I'm not getting the point for point of view. Because they don't just want you to say, I think this is somebody who wasn't cool with this. Or, I think this is a white guy who's rich. They don't care so much about that as much as they do whether or not you can explain how the person's point of view has an influence on the document itself. Because this person is anxious about the outsized power of large businesses, the industrialists in the cartoon are drawn as enormous figures, overshadowing the much smaller figures of the senators below them, suggesting that they truly are the bosses of the Senate and the real political power in the country. If this person was Rockefeller, he certainly wouldn't have drawn the cartoon this way. If Rockefeller could draw, he would have imagined the scene very, very differently. That's one thing you can talk about. If this were drawn from a different point of view, this is what it would have looked like, and really, clinch the point. But that's the kind of work, the intellectual work they want you to do when you're talking about point of view. Just to make sure you understand, there should be another body paragraph, paragraph number 2 here. But I didn't write one because I don't want to give any more, stuff away. All right, so that's my sample model response, or 2/3 of a model response. When you're done looking at yours, looking at this, go back to yours, grade it using one of the DBQ, one of the rubrics that are linked to the virtual lessons page, and then submit your self-reflection form. See how you did, score yourself, and then we'll go from there. Bye, everyone. I don't know, depends on when you're listening to this, but this is Friday for me, so have a great weekend. Or I hope you had a great weekend if you're listening to this when most of you will be, which is not. Well, actually, maybe a lot of you will be listening to this on a Friday, just a week from now. Am I still recording this? Yes, I am. I'm still talking. I should really stop talking now. Love you all. Goodbye.